I am Marty Henderson, senior pastor of the Peace Baptist Church in Gary, Indiana, as well as the CEO and executive director of the Peace Garden and Farms. My task this evening is one that I approach with a deep sense of gratitude and admiration. It's my responsibility to present our keynote speaker for this evening. I met our speaker, Karen Washington, vicariously through an email from a mutual friend, Beth Wakus of the Inside Garden Prison Ministries. And from that time, I have been following what she's doing, and then in December, I had the opportunity to meet her in person at the Stone Barn Center for Sustainable Agriculture, and everything that I was imagining came to pass. So this evening, we have the privilege of hearing a Queen Mother of social and food justice who will come and share with us out of the dynamic life that she shares in sustainable agriculture. Will you receive our friend, Karen Washington?
First of all, my name is Karen Washington. I tell people I'm a farmer. I grow food. I feed people body and mind. I have been on a whirlwind trip. First of all, this is not I thought that this was my first time in Indiana, but I forgot that my daughter went to Notre Dame. Yeah, you know how that is. You go to Notre Dame. So I remember traveling 20 years ago, 4 years in a row from New York City, 14-hour drive, South Bend, turn around and go back. But I had the pleasure of coming in on Wednesday night, and Thursday morning I was privy to going out and looking at some of the great work of urban agriculture in this area. And I was just taken away, again, because it reminded me of the work that I have been doing and the work that people in Philly and Baltimore and Oakland and Detroit that are doing to really uplift their communities. So I'm going to give this talk, which is based on growing food as a statement of power and justice. I have to follow my notes because they say this is being taped, and I want to make sure that I don't go off point because I have a tendency to get really wrapped up and dance around and really show my passion. And so I want to start, first of all, by just weaving my story and how I got to be where I am, how I got to really get involved in what food justice is all about. And it's very, very important. So I'm going to start off with first talking a little bit about myself, and also let me just step back really to thank Tamara, I guess, for inviting me to come here, because I tell people it's the power of asking. The reason why I am here, because someone took the time to invite me. And in many spaces that we are in, either if it's a conference or a workshop, you know, time and time again, there are things that people need to hear that are not here. And so how do we make sure as we move forward in this food movement that the people that need to hear what we have to say are present? And so I want to just sort of thank you for inviting me to come here today, and want to start off about my journey. Because when I was young and growing up, farming wasn't mentioned. Farming was more of a narrative around slave labor. It was a narrative that was spoken and taught to us growing up. I grew up in New York City, tall buildings, concrete jungle. And so my relationship to a farm was a park. My relationship to barn animals is what I saw either in a zoo or in a circus. Even in school, agriculture was never spoken unless it was a nursery rhyme. Old MacDonald had a farm, or this little piggy went to market. And so many of us, it had to do about the narrative of us leaving the South, because many of our families were farmers who farmed in the South, but felt by some sort of imagination that it would be better to leave the South and move up north for a quote unquote better life. And for me and for many of us, the South was something in the past. It was something that we heard that if you were bad, you went down south, or you were in trouble, you went down south. And many times we would see Jim Crow laws and segregation and say that was no place for colored folks. And many people who had land decided to leave. Either they left it and didn't think about paying taxes. Many of their children said, you know, I'm never going to go back down to that land. It was either sold for little or nothing, or was stolen from us. And so far away from the land and our food source, it never occurred to me how truly lost I was. Everything came from a supermarket or a department store. Never questioned where our food came from. Never questioned who grew it. Never questioned how it was grown. The fact that my mom was a good cook, she was a slamming good cook, 3 meals a day. For me, that was my sort of idea of what food system was all about. But then things started to change for me. As I started to put my hands in the soil, all of a sudden I started to get this sense of belonging. Living in New York City and trying to grow food wasn't easy. As you can see from this photo, I lived right across the street. At one point in time, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, just imagine, New York City had over 15,000 vacant lots, mostly in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color. And this was back in the early 1980s. But as I travel across the country, I still see pockets of neighborhoods that still look like this. And so many of us who could not move had to stay and form these empty lots into community gardens. Those that did have power and privilege left. They called it white flight. And so many times when people would come into our neighborhood and they would see these empty lots, back then I didn't know it was industrial racism and structural racism. We as people of color and working class people would get into these empty lots and clean them night after night. But in the next morning, they would be filled with garbage. We also had to fight drug addiction. At that time, crack cocaine was prevalent. Police brutality, so many social issues, but yet it never broke the backs of our spirit. It never broke the backs of people who, for once, got together to turn these empty lots into community gardens. And so when we looked at this sort of movement, folks, it wasn't about food. It couldn't be about food because we were trying to survive. We were trying to bring something that was full of despair and hopelessness and beautifying our neighborhoods so that when people came by to see our neighborhoods, they didn't see the ugliness. They didn't see the despair. What they saw was beautification. And so for me, as I started to go back into my community garden and starting to work and starting to think about the importance of food, I quickly understood that I just could not concentrate on food alone. That within my community gardens, I started to hear so many social issues. No heat, no hot water, overcrowding schools, police brutality, increase in prostitution and drug activities. And I realized that food for me had to intersect so many different issues. It had to intersect health and education, economics, housing, employment, and mental health. And when you look at these intersections, especially in this country, it falls along race, geographic, and economic lines. especially in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color. The struggle for good food and health and education and living wage jobs is an issue of racial, economic, and social justice, bringing to the forefront the social economic injustices we often see in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color. And if we don't intersect food into the social and economic issues and place value on it, it feeds into a system that is already dominated by a minority of people with power over. Food alone has no power, but once you place power onto it, it becomes valuable. The next slide. So when we talk about food security, this is the definition that the World Food Summit defined food security back in 1996. It states that food security as existing when all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active lifestyle. Which means is that this definition is built on the concept of 3 pillars: availability, accessibility, and safety. And if any one of these pillars are disrupted, then what we have is what we call food insecurity. And right now there's over 795 million people who are food insecure. Now, given the fact that I am told, and so many people have told us time and time again, that the food system is broken, how many of you believe that? No. No. I used to drink the Kool-Aid. I used to believe that the food system is broken. No, it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's designed to be a caste system. And I say that because, think about it. Cheap, subsidized food goes into poor neighborhoods, while healthy, nutritious food goes into wealthy ones. So just sort of think about that. So the next question that I ask, and I've asked this on our panel, and I've asked this throughout this conference, here we are, the United States of America, the richest country in the world, where we grow enough food, we waste enough food, and yet we have an entire population that has hunger, poverty, and diet-related diseases. And so if you look at this slide, 40 million people, folks, 40 million people in poverty. Every day, someone is going to bed homeless, hungry, getting their food from a soup kitchen or food pantry, having diet-related diseases, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and just think about it. These things back in the 1960s were non-existent. Now, they're more prevalent in our children. But if we look at the history of our food, it wasn't like this. In the early 1900s, 70% of our food was homegrown. 40% of our people lived on farms. Now, we're down to 2%. We had farms, great farms, 3.2 million farms. Now we're down to 1.9 million, and less for people of color. It is estimated by 2050, we will have an additional 2 billion more people on this planet, up from 7.8 billion people, which means we will have to grow 70% more food efficiently, and most of those people will be coming into urban areas. And yet what I find so astonishing, y'all, is that our grandparents and our great-grandparents grew up on farms. They never got their food from a supermarket or a bodega. They never used chemicals or caged their animals. They used nature and seasonality as their guide. Their stories of wisdom was handed down from generation to generation, becoming more powerful and sacred as time went on. Only to realize is that as we started to move away from the land, those stories and power started to diminish. And if you think about our indigenous ancestors, because I want you to sort of think about it, they never thought about owning anything. They never thought about owning land, owning animals, owning seeds, and most of all, owning people. They only used and took what was needed. So the question that I ask you all, has the land of honey become the land of milk, the land of greed and money? Can we actually say that we're much more better off because we are less labor intensive, more efficient and specialized, or a system where we grow more food, import more, and export less? We've gone from diversity to monocropping based on single commodity crops, corn and wheat and poultry and beef. We spend billions and billions of dollars on farm subsidies. As a matter of fact, at one time we spent over $293 million on high fructose corn syrup. And in some instances, we pay farmers not even to farm on their land. We've gone from a local economy to a global economy because of trade agreements. From home cooking to fast food cooking. From seasonality to eating beef and poultry and fruits and vegetables all year round. Even our palates have changed. At one time, we were able to taste sour and astringent and bitter. Now, it's salt and sugar. So if the tea isn't sweet enough, we're going to add some more sugar. If the food isn't salty enough, we're going to add more salt. Which boils down to American diet. Because if you think about the American diet, it was once plant-based. Plant-based, fruits, vegetables, grains. And once we added animals to our diet, our caloric intake has increased from 2,000 calories per capita to over 3,800 calories per capita. As a result, we have a food system of overabundance, which has resulted in a population of unhealthy and obese people. And we thought that this commercialization and industrialization of our food system would enable us to feed people better and cheaper, meaning bigger, better, faster. We become so mechanized that we have lost a generation of people who have no idea where their food comes from. They could care less about the ethics behind a growing food system and the danger that lurks behind a system that's so tenuous. This apathy is not a conscious one, but the fact that we have placed the responsibility and the safety of our food system in the hands of lobbyists and the government. We no longer eat at the table. We're not eating at the table. We eat in a family room, up in a bedroom, watching TV or playing video games. And many of us who work such long hours, we have to rely on a fast food joint because there's no food options. We become so detached from our food source that we have a whole generation who would believe that a tomato is grown in a supermarket or that chicken is from Chicken McNuggets. This gap will continue to grow if we don't stop and take back our narrative, our story, from companies who would have us to believe that ketchup should be listed as a vegetable and that GMO labeling is not in the best interest of the public. And even to go further, because you know where I'm going for this, folks, they are now insisting on labeling our communities with a broad stroke. And that labeling leads to my favorite, food deserts. This is a term that was introduced in the mid-1960s to describe poor communities with limited access to food and local supermarkets. It has now become a political brief and construct. No one in my neighborhood has ever used that term. I had to call my homies. I said, wait a second, Detroit and Baltimore and Philly, we live in a food desert? No, how could we? Well, we know that the problem is not the lack of food, because we do have food, but what we don't have is healthy food option. And what we know about the food system is that we grow enough food, we waste enough food, but that food is not getting down to the people that need it the most. It is not rocket science. So what I've coined the term is food apartheid. Because when I say food apartheid, everybody's ears and eyes wide open. Because what I want to bring to the conversation is that we need to talk about race. We need to talk about demographics. We need to talk about economics. People in the deserts will tell you themselves they have food. This is an outsider's term that is used to describe the populace of people to extract data. But behind those numbers and those checkoffs are people who are relying on a subsidized food system. And a subsidized food system that I have sort of brought to the forefront, because this is the pyramid that I see in my neighborhood. The three food groups: the junk food, cheap, low cost, imitates the colors and flavors with chemicals and additives. Next, the fast food, cheap, convenient, hidden dangers, and highly addictive. And next, which was supposed to revolutionize the food system, ta-da, the processed food. And so when we talk about these three food systems, we need to really talk about the inequities that we see in our food system. Because there are many voices, many agro-food scientists and corporations that will tell you, we know how to feed, and we know how to help food insecurity. We can do it with technology. People in poor neighborhoods, if they want to be food insecure, all we got to do is, let's give them a couple of gardens. Wait a second, let's now get rid of soda, which is being taxed. And I couldn't understand, why is soda being taxed on people and not on a soda company? But yet, so give them some land, they can grow food, let them sort of drink some water, and let them exercise. If by magic, eating vegetables and drinking water and having land is going to really solve the problem in our food system without looking at the institutional, political, and structural determinants that reinforce racism in today's society, all the inequities that we see in regards to wealth. Which brings us to my next thing, food justice. Okay, folks, be honest. How many of you have used the term food justice? Don't be afraid. All right? How many of you work in areas where you're working on food justice? Well, let me just tell you now, food justice doesn't exist. Woo. And I say that because it's been co-opted. It has been co-opted because everybody can give you the cookie-cutting different definition of what food justice is. But if you look at the definition of what it is, transformation of the current food system, including but not limited to eliminating disparities and inequities. I say, in order for you to be working in food justice, you have to be actively, that transformation, actively involved in working on social injustice. Yes. Yes. So if you're not actively working on social injustice, you're not doing food justice at all. You are just co-opting that definition to make yourself look good, and also you using it in your RFPs and your proposal because you figure that's where the money is, but you're not doing the work. And now, So in order to work on food justice, you got to work on social injustice. And so let's talk about some social injustice that you should be working on. First is persistent race, gender, and class inequalities. You can't tell me that if you look at the food system, you can see where the inequalities are based on people's race and demographics. You can also see the lack of opportunity to be self-sufficient and self-reliant. What does that mean? Because time and time again, people of color and people in poor neighborhoods, urban or rural, anytime they try to feed their families, to work amongst themselves because the government has neglected them, there are always rules and regulations to stop us. There's been redlining in housing. Now there's redlining in banking. Redlining in politics. So that every time we try to be self-sufficient and self-reliant because we no longer want to be the victims, there are policies, political policies, social policies in place to prevent us. The lack of land. Folks, y'all say, I'm still waiting for my 40 acres and a mule. We have to understand how important land access has been for those with privilege and power. Wealth has been built on the backs of enslaved people. Land was one of those things that have been stolen from us. And as a result, there's a populace of people that are building their wealth on land. Even today, land is being taken away from us. And then when we're trying to get land in urban areas to grow food, again, there are hurdles. Again, there are hurdles. But you know what? There are people, we'll talk a little later, that people are going back to the land because they know that land is equivalent to power. Economics. I had said this in the workshop about economics. Folks, I don't want no more charity-based food system that comes into my neighborhood to feed my people. Doesn't work. It's a Band-Aid. You can't feed people like that. People need jobs, ownership, investment, financial literacy, how to work on credit, how to own a house, how to own a business, how to invest not in terms of monetary value, but invest in social capital. Because we can't replicate the capitalistic system that we have that extracts from our neighborhoods. We need to build an economy that brings wealth back into our neighborhoods and start having those conversations. And they need to start when people are young. And they need to start with all farmers. Because I say to farmers, if you're not thinking about economic wealth or investment when you're farming, then you're not doing farming. Because so many farmers get old and they never thought about investing within themselves as part of a farm package. So I'm telling to you young folks, you got to think about putting some money aside, how to invest so that when you retire you have something, because Social Security is not going to be there. Understanding the historical content of trauma. Ooh, baby. People, this is something that no one talks in our community. You got to be able to talk about trauma when you have had a group of people who have been oppressed. Because that trauma 400 years ago goes from generation to generation to generation. And so you never understand, like, why are these people angry? Why are there's this pent-up energy? Because no one talks about the scars that oppression leaves behind. And we need to start having that conversation, especially for those that work in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color and poor folks. Yes. Power, and we're going to talk about that a little later, but we'll talk about it because I'm getting excited here now. I'm getting a little excited. Let me just calm myself down here. All right, because now we talked about food justice. So now everyone is sort of excited because they've been talking about food justice and making themselves really good because, you know, I work for food justice and part of my farm's mission is food justice, even though they don't know what it is, but it just sounds good. So now I'm going to bring it a little further, and I'm going to add food sovereignty to it. Now, how many of you heard food sovereignty? Oh, yeah, baby. I know you heard food sovereignty because food justice wasn't enough. So I got to put a little food sovereignty in it because I got to make sure that you understand I know more. It's not about just food justice. It's food sovereignty. But again, co-opted means nothing because it is the right of people and governments to choose the way food is produced, consumed in order to respect our livelihoods as well as the policies that support this choice. By La Via Campesina, this was done and stated by farmers and peasants of the global South as they have been marching towards self-governance, self-reliance, land ownership, to be able to control their destiny, their land, their seeds. And we have used that, not in their context, but what we feel that we should be using food sovereignty because it sounds good, without giving recognition to what that means for the farmers and peasants of the global South. And so if we look at food justice and food sovereignty together, they both talk about the goal of less dependency on capital-intensive inputs that extract, and a greater intention on the social and economic and environmental principles that build communal wealth. In other words, they don't know, when you work on food justice, you work on food sovereignty, they're working on giving control back to the people, giving control back to the people for self-governance, giving control back to the people so that the wealth that is built stays in the community. Because for so long, again, that capitalistic society that has extracted resources, monetary value out of people that need it the most are now turning it around to make sure that wealth and social capital stays within those communities. And so, in principle, both place equity in the decision-making process and the distribution of resources when it comes to the so-called food movement, advocating for better control over food production and consumption by people who have been marginalized by people with power. Woo! We going there now. We going there now because it starts with power, y'all. Time and time again, people say, what is it that I can do? What is I can do? So I tell people, if you look at power, power's like a drug. It's a drug. I got power. I don't want to give it up. I don't want to give my power up. And so if we think about power, we have to think about that as long as we have a food system that embraces a power dynamic society, it will remain stagnant and resistant to change. That's right. Because nobody want to give it up. From small farmers to growers to farm workers, a healthy system is not just about growing food, but making sure that the people along the food chain are treated fairly and humanely. Food has now become a commodity, y'all, based on profits and not on people. In order for the food system to change, we must face the fact it is about sharing or giving up power. A food system that is controlled and dominated by white privilege and wealth with a historical frame of power over has to acknowledge it and give that power up. And so I tell people, with power, you got three things. With power, either you're going to share it. How y'all think about that? Sharing it? Give it up. Or I'm going to take it. So those are the three options. Either you're going to share it, give it up, or the people who have been oppressed are going to eventually take it. And so when does this power dynamic show up in our food system? Well, it shows up in our society when we don't have it, hunger. When we can't afford it, poverty. When it's killing us, diet-related diseases. When we don't deserve it because someone said, you know what, you need some organic food, but the thing is, we ain't got organic food. And when others control us, such as Big Ag. We have a government that wants to build walls to keep the same people who are at the forefront of our economy, namely the farm workers, the factory workers, and restaurant workers. And so I also want to sort of think about that word farm workers, because I hate that word farm workers, because aren't they the farmers who work? We need to give them their due. They are farmers instead of farm workers. We tend not to acknowledge the fact that the agricultural economy of capitalism we see today, again, is built on the backs of enslaved people. So already have a population that has one leg up. We've come to a breaking point where we've seen our family members get sicker and sicker, healthy food choices slimmer and slimmer, and our communities being displaced off their land or from their homes. We watch as our men and women of color are enslaved in the criminal justice system, which amounts to modern-day slavery. Well, folks across this country are starting to voice their concern over an unhealthy and biased food system. There is a growing movement of people wanting to take control of their food system. They understand the power of growing food and going back to the land. Remember trickle-down economics? Well, it never trickled down to the people who need it the most, especially people in poor urban and rural areas. So people started to take matters in their own hands. So what are people doing across this country trying to take control and power over their food system? Well, they're reclaiming land and developing community gardens and urban farms and forming community land trusts. They're growing food that is culturally appropriate because they can't find it in a supermarket or bodega. They're saving seeds in defiance of companies. Folks, can you just sort of make me understand how we have allowed a handful of companies to control our seeds, when in fact we are seeds. And so if we allow companies to control our seeds in DNA, we are next. Think about it. Or the fact that they're now growing herbs for healing and medicine. Many are forming cooperative, leveraging their power of collaboration. They're rewriting the history and story of this country from indigenous people and enslaved people, because Columbus didn't discover America. America was already here. They're forming farmers markets, turning buses into mobile markets, supporting small and local farmers, bridging the gap between urban and rural farmers coming together and working at farmers market because they know it's the people that need that food the most. Holding conferences and workshops given by people who look like them. So, before I leave, I always give people homework assignments. So y'all got some homework assignment to do in terms of action steps. Again, the power asking. I'm here because someone asked me to come here. And again, we have to think about when we are having conferences and workshops and we're trying to get that information out to our rural farmers and our urban farmers, we have to make sure that they're in the room to hear it, that they need to understand that there's resources out there that need to be shared. Again, talking about power. Power needs to be shared, or you need to give it up. Or if not, it's going to be taken. Share your stories. I tell young people, you got those Samsung Galaxy phones, you got those iPhones. If you're lucky to have grandparents and great-grandparents who grew up on farms, take them out and capture those stories, because that's your history. That's your lifeline. Because I guarantee 10, 20 years from now, they're going to tell you your family never farmed. So it's important to have those stories. It's important for African Americans to understand their history, because for so long our history has been defined by slavery. But if you think about who were the first farmers, we were. Because if you look at us coming with the colonists back in the early days when they settled in Georgia and South Carolina, the climate was the same as in Africa. We have sickle cell trait because we can work against malaria. We were the ones that came to this country to teach the farmers about crop rotation and irrigation. We were the ones who made a lot of the tools, but yet that narrative had been stolen from us. And we were taught that we came here unskilled in agriculture, but we came here skilled in agriculture. And that we never saw in a book. We need farmers to work with farmers. We need farmers to teach young people how to farm. As I said from the very beginning earlier, I'm 65 years of age. The average age of a farmer is 58 years of age. If we don't start grooming young people to farm, we will not have any farmers, regardless, urban or rural. We need to start grooming our young people, and we need for us farmers, especially our elders, to start giving up that knowledge and pass it on to the next generation of people who want to farm, because they want to farm. I see it all the time. They want to farm. So if you have land, if you have resources, if you have knowledge, that needs to be passed down to the next generation, no matter of color. And next, I tell people, the three things I tell people to give people who have been powerless. Give people three things. Give them capital, give them land, and give them opportunity. People who are once deemed powerless become powerful. And lastly, let's develop youth leadership. I tell, my elders, we got to sit down and shut up. You know what I'm saying? Because we need innovative ideas from our youth. They know how to do social media. They know how to navigate the system. They know how to use computers. They are innovators. They have ideas. They know how to make this country better. And so for us, we have to give up that power and allow our young people, lift them up so that they can voice their leadership and we can see them shine. Lastly, this is who I am with my friends. We are Rise and Root Farm, 3 acres up in Chester, New York. It has been a journey. Farming is hard. Farmers need to be appreciated more. And we farmers need to make sure that we educate people about the cost and value of our food. Our food is not free. So we need to start having those conversations. And lastly, I'm going to leave you all with this. To grow your own food gives you power. You know who and why you grew it. You grew it for yourself, your family, and your community. And thank you all so much. Woo. Woo. Indiana, y'all are some fine people. Just get it together. Y'all can move mountains. All right, I'm done.
We have a few more minutes in the presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
Don't be afraid. I don't bite.
After 4:30.
Do you have in a sense, business plan or structure of how to be able to integrate into the neighborhoods that are needing urban farming?
Yes. So the question is, how do you integrate? And I always say, you know what? It starts with people. You need to ask, I always say you need to ask people in the neighborhood, you need to ask them what they want and not what they need. Because when you ask a person what they need, it comes from a place of deficit. When you ask a group what they want, it comes from a position of power. So that's what you do first. It's like, what is it that you want? And it opens up a dialogue. So start with that. Good question. And I'll take maybe one more because I'm tired, y'all. One more question. I got a question. So how many of you, no, don't be shy now because now we family here now. How many of y'all are really putting money aside and saving? How many need to do that? So, because I want, I was lucky. I didn't tell you I used to be a physical therapist. I was there, I was a physical therapist 37 and a half years. I remember, like I was telling people, from kindergarten, I had a bank book. My parents put in a quarter or 50 cents. I was around a family that talked about investments and so as a farmer, even my 3 friends, I'm on them all the time because they always say, well, Karen, I don't have any money to put away. I don't have money to put away. They're in their 30s and 40s. Social Security is not going to be around, let's face it, in order for you to live. And so I want people to start thinking about how do you invest? And there are ways that I know young people are starting to look at ways, because you don't want to invest in fossil fuels. You don't want to invest in, things that harm the environment. But we got to find a way that we invest, but not only in terms of monetary capital, but in social capital. But everybody should be thinking when you do your farming plan, you need to put some money aside so that, because if you think that, well, I'm going to invest in a farm and then the land's going to pay, and it's not going to happen. So I want you to start thinking about what does that look like in my farming plan? And then also I want communities to start thinking about what does investment look like? What is it that how can we pull our monies together to buy things, to start businesses? And another thing I would just advise too, because when I first started in this urban ag movement, rural farmers were scared. And when rural farmers got this misconception, oh my goodness, they're gonna start growing food in the city and then we're gonna have no money. And it's like, no, we growing food because no one is coming in our communities to bring food. And so then especially in Indiana, when I saw the map of so many farmers markets that are not even near communities that need it. And so how does that happen? That's number one. How does that happen? How do you have a farmers market and you don't have a social justice mission that prevents you from going into a community because you've heard the word urban? So as soon as people, those are those catchphrases. It's an urban area, so immediately you think black and poor. But poor people got money. You know what I'm saying? And so we need to figure out how do we bring rural farmers into urban areas so that they can buy your food. I just found out that Indiana is the first in terms of produce and all this, but yet you'll have hunger and poverty. How does that happen? How does that happen? How do the farmers sleep at night knowing that they're one of the first in the country with food, but yet there are pockets of people that don't have their food? And when you'll go to because I run a farmer's market, at the end of the day, when that food is not sold, what do? We bring it back home. Either we put it in a compost bin, to charity, but there are people that need that food. And so we need to get rural farmers, to come into these I hate to food apartheid, and feed these people. Let Indiana be an example. Let Indiana be an example where rural farmers are willing to come into urban areas and feed people. And again, it's not about free food. It's about getting people to pay the food, but understanding that your food is there to feed people. And so that's what I am leaving with what I've learned about Indiana, this great state of farmers. But what hurts me is that there are people who are hungry. And as farmers, our job is to make sure we feed people. And if people are hungry, then we cannot sleep at night unless people are fed. Let Indiana be that example to make sure that it can help eradicate hunger and poverty, especially in low-income neighborhoods, both urban and rural. Thank you.